Hello students, this video is about the blood and ventilation systems. By the end of this video, we should be able to answer the essential question, how does blood transport nutrients, oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as hormones, antibodies, urea, and heat? So if we break down just this question, we know nutrients, that ties us back to the digestive system, oxygen and carbon dioxide, that's where the ventilation system comes in, and then those others are things that we're going to talk about more in the future. So we're thinking about how do things get around our body so that every cell is able to communicate with every other and we can be a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Let's begin by talking about blood. So there's a couple different parts of blood itself. Here's the components. Here are some descriptions of what it is. So we start with plasma. That's the majority of our blood. It's that liquid portion. Within that, it's mostly water as well as some nutrients that get transported as well as some proteins. That's all our plasma. You have our erythrocytes. Those are our red blood cells. Their job is to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have our leukocytes. Those are our white blood cells, including phagocytes and lymphocytes. Their job is to primarily fight infection. And we have platelets. They're little cell fragments that are mostly going to assist in blood clotting if we ever get injured. Now there's a bunch of stuff that gets transported by this stuff. Nutrients get transported, oxygen, carbon dioxide, hormones, antibodies, urea, and heat, which you can't actually see down there. All those different things are transported by the blood. And the question becomes, how? To begin with, we need to have some vessels. So the vessels are going to be the roads, highway system within our body. Arteries are always going to move things away from the heart. I remember that because they both start with A. And veins are always going to move things towards the heart. And then capillaries are the tiny, tiny vessels that connect those two. If we look at arteries, veins, and capillaries, they have some structural differences that allow them to meet their functions. Always remember, in biology, we have a connection between structure and function. So if we look at a couple of these different things, first, let's look at diameter. We know that arteries and veins are generally going to be larger than 10 micrometers, where capillaries are at 10 micrometers or smaller. So we know that arteries and veins, just by their definition, are larger than capillaries themselves. Now if we look at the relative thickness of the wall and diameter of the lumen being the space in the middle, we see there's some differences between arteries, capillaries, and veins. First, arteries have this relatively thick wall and a relatively narrow lumen. If we think about why, arteries are connected to the heart itself, and every time the heart squeezes, a large volume of blood will be pushed through with a large amount of pressure. And so these walls are thick to prevent any aneurysms, which is a hole happening in the vessel, from occurring. By the time that we get the blood all the way back to the veins, there's less pressure remaining because a lot of the velocity has been lost in the capillaries and through movement, and so the veins don't need to be as thick to prevent bursting. If we look at the number of layers that are in each part, there's some similarities here between arteries and veins, where they generally have 3 layers, whereas capillaries only have a single layer. That's going to allow a lot of the diffusion to happen straight through the capillary walls because they're so thin. Muscle and elastin fibers, these are going to be the things that hold these into their shapes. Arteries have a whole bunch of elastin and a whole bunch of muscle that allow them again to maintain that shape for the same reason that their wall is so thick. Veins have a little bit and capillaries have basically none. Then valves is this last part. So arteries don't have any valves, capillaries don't have any valves, but veins, a lot of them do have valves, and that's illustrated in this image right here. If we think about the reason why, we know that veins are returning blood to the heart. If you think about a vein that comes from your foot, you don't want the blood to go backwards to like pool in your feet. You want the blood always to move back up towards your heart. But because there's not a lot of pressure left at this point, it can be possible for the blood to flow backwards. So there's these valves that prevent that backwards flow of blood. Then every time you move a muscle, it's going to allow blood to come towards the heart and prevent that backflow. Let's talk about the heart itself. It's this magnificent pump that allows us to move blood throughout our entire body through those vessels we just talked about. So there's definitely a lot of structures within the heart that allow it to do its function. The biggest thing I want to talk about here is we have atria on top and ventricles on the bottom. So there's 4 chambers to our heart. The human heart has 4 chambers, as do all mammals, but not all organisms do, and thinking about that difference is a really interesting evolutionary side note. But if we're talking about a four-chambered heart, then we're going to have blood that flows from the atria to a ventricle and then out, then back to an atria, ventricle, and out. So it'll be this like double pump idea, where we go from the top to the bottom and then out, top to bottom and then out. This is going to allow a couple different types of circulation to occur. So let's start here with going to the body. So let's say the blood leaves the aorta, which is our largest vessel, and it goes through that artery, splits up, goes throughout the body. Through those little capillaries, it's going to deliver the nutrients, pick up the waste from the entire body, and then eventually it'll come back into the veins. The largest vein is the vena cava. There's the superior vena cava coming from the top, and the inferior vena cava coming from the bottom, and those are going to connect, and they're going to empty the blood into the right atrium. Then this is going to start pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary means lungs. Anytime you see that word, just think in your head, ooh, pulmonary, lungs. So that right atrium, the blood is going to pool there, and then there's going to be a valve known as the atrioventricular valve. It's going to go through that atrioventricular valve, then enter that right ventricle. Then there'll be a squeeze. It'll go through a semilunar valve, which are the ones that empty into the veins or the arteries that leave the heart. So we'll go through that semilunar valve, then it'll take those pulmonary arteries to the lungs. So pulmonary arteries, they are arteries because they go away from the heart, but they don't have oxygen in them yet. They're deoxygenated, so they're going to go to the lungs themselves, and in this space they're going to get rid of their waste carbon dioxide, and they're going to pick up oxygen from the lungs. Then it's going to return to the heart via pulmonary veins, which are oxygenated, to the left atrium of the heart, which will then flow through the left atrioventricular valve into the left ventricle, which is our largest, strongest chamber of the heart. Then when that squeezes, the blood will flow through the left semilunar valve, back to the aorta, back to the body. So we have this double circulation, pulmonary circulation, systemic circulation, which means body. Pulmonary, systemic, over and over and over again, so that oxygenated blood can be delivered to the places it needs to be in our body. Here's an image that just shows that again. If we follow one of these bits of blood, even though they're kind of fast, we've got from the top to the bottom, atria to ventricle, then out to lungs, then back to ventricle, then out, then back, again and again, this double circuit. Now, how fast the heart is going to squeeze is dependent on several different things. So control of heart rate happens a couple different ways. First of all, the way that cardiac muscle works is that it's going to spontaneously contract and relax in conjunction. That's called myogenic muscle contraction. It's a special type of cardiac muscle that allows that to happen. There's going to be a little node found approximately there. That little node is known as the sinoatrial node, or the SA node. That is going to be the pacemaker. What is going to occur right there is it's going to send out a little electrical signal that's going to cause the squeezing of the atria. Then with a tiny, small time delay, there's going to be the AV node down here, atrioventricular node, which is going to cause the squeezing of the ventricles. So pacemaker initiates the squeezing. AV node is going to continue the squeezing with the ventricles. Now, how fast that pacemaker is going to squeeze is based on a couple of different things. The first one is the brain. So there's part of our brain, the medulla of the brain, that is going to have two different nerves. One nerve that's primarily responsible for increasing heart rate, and one nerve that's primarily responsible for decreasing heart rate. And that part of the brain will get signals from the body on what's going on. So it looks for things like low blood pressure. If there's low blood pressure, that's a signal to the medulla to increase heart rate. If there's low oxygen concentration in the blood, that's a signal to the medulla to increase heart rate. Or if there's low pH. So pH, how acid or base something is, if there's low pH, that means it's very acidic. If we had a lot of carbon dioxide in our blood, it starts to dissolve in water and it creates carbonic acid. And so a low pH in our body is an indication that we need to speed heart rate so we can get rid of that extra carbon dioxide. The opposite is true. If there's high blood pressure, high oxygen concentration, or high pH or higher pH, that is going to slow our heart rate. There's also another chemical that is going to be produced by the adrenal glands. It's known as epinephrine or adrenaline. That's our fight or flight response hormone. That is always going to increase the heart rate. So if ever there's something happening that's a high stress situation, then that can be produced, which will increase heart rate as well. So when we're looking at this heartbeat that occurs, there's a couple different ways that we can represent it. And one way is using cardiac cycle, and we can do that with a couple of different things. First, we can look at an electrocardiogram, where we're able to measure those electrical signals that are happening from a couple of different places. Generally, electrocardiogram is going to have a signal where it goes up, goes down, and continues throughout the cardiac cycle. A lot of times when you see on like medicine shows the little like electrocardiogram, that's one way that we monitor heart a lot in medicine. We could also look at the pressure within different parts of the heart. For example, if we were comparing the pressure of things like the aorta, that giant artery leaving the heart, to the left ventricle, to the left atrium, then we'd be able to see some differences in those pressure when different events are occurring. We can also look at the volume of the ventricles, so that would be how open they are. When they squeeze, that's when our volume is going to be decreased. So we can represent this also by looking at images of what's happening in different parts of the heart. Now you're going to be asked to interpret a couple of cardiac diagrams in a couple of different ways, and hopefully you start to see some similarities between different ways to represent the heart, but still similar things that are occurring. I'm going to talk very briefly about some history of this. So it's sort of hard to think about the fact that every time we know something about the heart, which seems like there's just so much to know and so many different ways to represent it here, it all comes down to people and people who did some work. One of the big people who did work with figuring out the anatomy and physiology of the heart is going to be this dude, William Harvey, who lived way long time ago. I just like this quote that he has. I think it shows the human nature of science. So he talks about this. He says, "I found the task so truly arduous," he was talking about discovering circulation, "that I almost tempted to think that the movement of the heart was only to be comprehended by God. For I could neither rightly perceive at first when the systole and when the diastole took place by the reason of the rapidity of the movement." And so even this guy who's known in history is figuring out a lot of different things, still struggles with understanding these. And that's something we forget about science, but it's definitely something that always occurs. So we know one of the big jobs of the blood is to move carbon dioxide out and oxygen in to each one of the cells, and that requires the ventilation system. So the ventilation system actually works at several different scales. First, there's this process of ventilation, which is just the breathing in, the breathing out at the largest scale. Then if we go a scale smaller, we're talking about gas exchange, which is the passive diffusion of oxygen in the lung tissue to the blood and carbon dioxide to the lung tissue. And additionally, that same passive diffusion back and forth within the cells from the capillaries. Finally, if we're talking our smallest level of ventilation, we're talking why? Like, why do we need oxygen? Why do we produce carbon dioxide? And the answer to that is cell respiration, this process that allows our cells to produce the ATP energy they can use. There's a bunch of different parts to the ventilation system themselves, and like so many things, each one of these structures helps support the function of the system as a whole. One place that we will see this is in the alveolar cells. So these are the tiny little air sacs known as alveoli. They've got a couple different types of cells that are going to help them. Type 2 nematocytes and type 1 nematocytes. Type 2 nematocytes, they're going to produce surfactant, which is like a liquidate stuff that helps lubricate the lungs. And then type 1 nematocytes, they're going to be super small, super flat to allow really rapid diffusion. Connection between structure and function. Here's a couple of just spelled out examples of how there's a connection between the adaptations we see and the advantages to our body, so the structures and the functions. You may want to pause it here just to see some of these adaptations and their advantages. Final thing I want to talk about very quickly is the idea of antagonistic muscle action. So in order for us to breathe at that big scale, that ventilation scale, there's going to be some different muscles that work together to allow this. Inspiration breathing in, expiration breathing out. There's always going to be pairs that allow this to happen. So hopefully this was helpful. A lot of stuff. I know you can